Welcome to SnoozeCrime. Tonight we begin with a house that should have been safe, a family asleep, a bedroom shared by two sisters, an open window in the dark, and a 14-year-old girl taken silently from her own bed. The kidnapping of Elizabeth Smart became one of the most recognized missing child cases in America, not only because of the scale of the search, but because of what the facts would later reveal. A man the family had once known only briefly, a child hidden shockingly close to home, and months of captivity carried out in a way that forced the public to confront something deeply unsettling: that a victim can remain alive, can move through public spaces, can be seen by other people, and still remain trapped inside fear, coercion, and control. This is not a story about mystery for mystery's sake. The court record eventually answered the central question of who took Elizabeth Smart. What remains is something harder to sit with: how the crime was allowed to continue for so long, how recognition kept failing, and how survival can look very different from what outsiders expect. This is SnoozeCrime, real cases, told slowly. A 14-year-old girl was taken from her bed in the middle of the night by a man her family had once let onto their property to do handyman work. He entered through a window, pressed a weapon to her, and led her out, while her 9-year-old sister lay still in the same room, too frightened to move. By dawn, one question was already beginning to spread far beyond Salt Lake City. How does a child disappear from the center of her own home, with her family only feet away, and leave behind almost nothing except an open window and fear? In the early hours of June 5, 2002, the Smart home in Salt Lake City became the site of one of the most unsettling child abductions in modern American memory. Elizabeth Smart, 14 years old, was sleeping in a bedroom she shared with her younger sister, Mary Catherine. Sometime around 2 a.m., an intruder came in through a kitchen window after cutting the screen. He moved through the house and into the girl's room without waking the rest of the family. Mary Catherine later became the first witness to what happened, though at the time she could not fully understand what she was seeing. She woke to the presence of a man standing near the bed. He threatened Elizabeth and forced her to get up. Mary Catherine, afraid the man would hurt her too, pretended to be asleep. That decision would become one of the defining details of the case, not because it was unusual, but because it was the kind of fear people imagine only after something has already gone terribly wrong. The image that remained with the public was simple and brutal. A child taken from the room where she should have been safest. No roadside encounter, no schoolyard abduction, no vanished teenager last seen leaving with friends. Elizabeth Smart was taken from inside her family's house in a quiet neighborhood, while her parents and siblings slept nearby. That fact alone changed the emotional temperature of the case. It did not feel distant. It felt invasive. At first, the details seemed almost too thin to hold. Mary Catherine believed the abductor had a gun, though later accounts and court records established that Elizabeth had been taken at knifepoint. The intruder spoke quietly. He did not crash through the house in a frenzy. He was calm enough to control the room, and calm enough to get Elizabeth out without waking everyone at once. In hindsight, that quietness became one of the most disturbing details in the case. It suggested planning, confidence, and a man who believed he could move through a family home and out again before the house caught up with what had happened. Elizabeth was led out of the room and out of the house. Mary Catherine stayed where she was. That delay would later be scrutinized in public discussion, but it matched the logic of fear. She was 9 years old. She had just watched a stranger threaten her sister in the dark. According to later timelines and testimony, she waited roughly 2 hours before alerting her parents. The family's 911 call was logged at 4:01 a.m., and Salt Lake City police were dispatched at 4:02. Those 2 hours mattered. but not in the easy way later criticism sometimes implied. In many cases, delay creates suspicion. Here, it revealed terror. Mary Catherine did not know whether the man was still inside. She did not know whether making noise would get Elizabeth killed. She did not know whether he would come back. The house, for that stretch of time, had stopped functioning like a home and started functioning like a place under control. When she finally went to her parents, the first reaction was confusion. It was the middle of the night. A child had delivered an almost impossible account. For a brief moment, the story did not sound real enough to be real. Then the adults saw the physical signs. A kitchen window was open. The screen had been cut. Patio chairs were positioned beneath the window. Those details gave shape to the nightmare immediately. This was not sleep confusion. This was forced entry. The first officers arriving at the smart home stepped into the kind of scene that feels ordinary only until the facts settle. A missing child call can begin in uncertainty. Teenagers leave. Children hide. Families misunderstand. But here the physical evidence pointed in a different direction from the start. Officers observed the open kitchen window and the cut screen. The account from inside the bedroom, even with all its limits, described a stranger removing a teenage girl from her own bed. This was not a runaway case. It was a kidnapping investigation from the first morning. That distinction changed everything. The scale of response widened quickly. Search efforts moved around the smart property and into the nearby foothills. Elizabeth's age, the forced entry, and the nighttime removal from the house made the case urgent in a way few disappearances immediately become. Law enforcement, neighbors, volunteers, and the media began converging on the same central fear. Elizabeth Smart had not wandered away. Someone had taken her, and he had done it with enough control to leave very little behind. There was another detail, small at first, that would become more important later. Mary Catherine thought the voice of the intruder sounded familiar. At the time, that was not proof of anything. Trauma distorts memory. Darkness strips away certainty. Children notice pieces without knowing what they mean. But even in the first phase of the case, that sense of familiarity sat in the background like a warning. The man had entered as a stranger, yet something about him did not feel entirely unknown. In the first hours, the public did not know that part. What people saw instead was a family suddenly thrown into the raw mechanics of a search. Ed and Lois Smart were no longer simply parents in a private emergency. They were about to become the public face of one of the most watched missing child cases in the country. That transformation did not happen because they sought attention. It happened because the facts demanded it. A teenage girl had been abducted from inside a respectable home in Salt Lake City, and there was no reassuring explanation available by daylight. The neighborhood setting only deepened the unease. Federal Heights was not a place people associated with a child being lifted from bed and taken into the dark. The crime violated expectations that are often left unspoken until they fail. Houses are supposed to separate the family from the outside. Bedrooms are supposed to be the last interior boundary. A child taken from a sidewalk is frightening. A child taken from her bedroom creates a different kind of national fixation because it breaks the scene people rely on most. And then there was the practical problem investigators faced almost immediately. They had a forced entry point. They had a witness who had seen and heard some of what happened. They had a timeline narrow enough to be chilling, but they did not have a clear suspect, a vehicle, a usable public description strong enough to identify one person or a known direction of travel. The area near the home opened toward foothills and canyons. In the first hours, that geography widened the fear. Elizabeth could have been close. She could have already been far away. The search had to begin without knowing which possibility was worse. Cases like this often generate instant assumptions, and this one was no different. Some people looked toward sex offenders, some looked toward transients, some looked toward anyone who had ever been near the family. Rumors began almost as quickly as facts. That would become one of the defining features of the Elizabeth Smart case. A huge volume of attention, much of it sincere, much of it chaotic, and not all of it useful. But on that first day, before the psychics, before the false sightings, before the national saturation, the investigation still rested on a smaller and more unsettling truth. Someone had entered that home with enough knowledge and nerve to find Elizabeth and take her out alive. Later, the known facts would make that first night look even stranger. Brian David Mitchell, the man eventually convicted in federal court of kidnapping Elizabeth Smart and transporting her across state lines for sexual purposes, was not a random figure generated by a sketch and a tip line. He was a self-styled preacher who had briefly worked for the Smart family months earlier after Lois Smart encountered him in Salt Lake City and hired him for yard and roof work. In hindsight, that earlier contact would recast the entire abduction. The crime had not begun with a stranger selecting a target from nowhere. It had begun with someone who had already crossed the boundary once and been allowed inside the family's world. But that realization did not exist yet on June 5, 2002. On that morning, the case still looked like a terrifying blank. Elizabeth was gone. Mary Catherine had seen enough to know the abduction was real, but not enough to tell police exactly who had taken her. The family could only answer the most painful questions in fragments. What was she wearing? When had she last been seen? Had anyone unusual been around the house? Did she know someone who might have lured her? The structure of a criminal case was beginning to form, but it still had no center. That is one reason the opening hours mattered so much. They fixed the case in two ways at once. Privately, they shattered the Smart family's sense of safety. Publicly, they established the logic that would drive everything after. Elizabeth Smart had not disappeared under vague circumstances. She had been removed from her home by force. The cut screen, the open window, the witness in the room, and the missing girl turned a family emergency into a national emergency before the day had fully begun. By the time police and media understood what they were dealing with, the shape of the story had already become unusually hard to bear. A child had been taken from the center of her own life. The person who took her seemed organized, quiet, and deliberate. The witness was a younger sister left with a partial memory and a familiar voice she could not yet place. It seemed small until it didn't. And by the end of that first morning, one thing was clear. This was not a routine missing person case. It was a kidnapping carried out from inside the deepest part of a family home, and the search had only just begun. By the time the 911 call came in at 4:01 that morning, the abduction had already been unfolding for roughly 2 hours. Inside the Smart home, fear and confusion had given way to the first rough outline of what had happened. Elizabeth Smart was gone. The kitchen window was open. The screen had been cut, and the only person who had seen the intruder, 9-year-old Mary Catherine Smart, had spent those missing hours frozen by the belief that if she moved too soon, the man might come back. That delay would matter later, but in the first hours it did something else. It shaped the entire beginning of the investigation. Police were not walking into an active break-in. They were walking into the aftermath of a carefully executed removal. The person who had entered the house had already had time to leave the neighborhood, cross open ground, or disappear into the foothills above Salt Lake City. The first responding officers had urgency, but very little direction. The call itself was stark. A child had been taken from her bed. There had been forced entry. The suspect had gone through the house and left with a 14-year-old girl, while the family slept nearby. Those facts made the case immediately different from a large number of missing child calls that begin in uncertainty. Officers did not have to spend long deciding whether this was a runaway, a misunderstanding, or a teenager avoiding home for the night. The scene pushed them in a more serious direction almost at once. Inside the house, the details were still fragile. Mary Catherine had seen a man in the room. She heard him threatening Elizabeth. She understood enough to know that he was in control. But she was a child describing something witnessed in darkness and terror. Her account was essential yet limited. She could not hand investigators a complete suspect description. She could only describe the shape of what she had seen and the fear that had kept her still. That is often how the first hours of a major case actually begin. Not with a clean narrative, but with frightened fragments. A sound, a figure, a voice. A sequence that is remembered out of order, because memory under stress is not a camera. It records what feels dangerous, not always what later investigators most want to know. In the Elizabeth Smart case, the investigators' first witness was a 9-year-old girl carrying that exact burden. Still, some things were immediately usable. The cut window screen mattered. It showed planning and physical entry from outside. The open kitchen window mattered too because it marked the route in. It was not a vague claim that someone had simply gone missing in the night. There was a point of intrusion. There was a path into the home. There were patio chairs beneath the window that suggested the intruder had used them to climb in. That physical evidence did not identify a man, but it did identify a method. It also forced a question that would become more important as the day went on. Why this house and why this room? The Smart family home was not selected by accident in the ordinary sense. The intruder had entered and moved with enough confidence to reach Elizabeth's bedroom. He had not wandered through the property in confusion. He had not made noise that woke the whole house. He had not taken property and left. He had come for a person. That distinction changed the thinking early. This was not a burglary that turned into something worse. It looked more like a targeted abduction from the beginning. Investigators began the first sweep around the house and nearby area, while the family remained inside the shock of the event. The terrain near the Smart home mattered. The neighborhood sat close to foothills and mountain trails. In a case involving a nighttime abduction on foot, that geography created a disturbing possibility. The abductor might not have used a car at all. He could have led Elizabeth uphill into terrain that became difficult to search in the dark, then hidden before daylight exposed anything. That possibility was not theoretical. It was built into the environment. The open land above Salt Lake City offered brush, slope, shadows, and pathways that a determined person could use to evade immediate detection. In the first hours, police and volunteers searched the surrounding area with the hope that Elizabeth had been left nearby or that some sign of movement might still be visible. But those hopes ran into the same problem that defines many early searches. Time had already passed. The gap between the abduction and the call had given the offender a lead. At the time, no one knew what to make of that lead. Was it enough time to leave the city entirely? Was it enough time only to reach a hiding place close by? The answer would eventually be one of the most unsettling parts of the case. But on June 5, 2002, police still had to work both possibilities at once. That made the first witness interview especially important. Mary Catherine's account was not just the only direct testimony from inside the bedroom. It was the only way to understand whether the intruder seemed like a total stranger, whether he said anything distinctive, whether he sounded young or old, and whether anything about him suggested prior familiarity with the family. In many cases, those first impressions collapse under scrutiny. Here, one of them would grow stronger. At first, What stood out was less certainty than unease. Mary Catherine had heard the man's voice. She had seen enough of him to know he was not a dream or a shadow, and something about him did not feel entirely unknown. She could not immediately identify him. She did not give police a clear name in those first hours, but the possibility that the offender knew the house or had at least observed it before was already beginning to hang over the case. The problem was that suspicion of familiarity is not evidence. Investigators could not build a search operation around a feeling. They still had to process the house, document the entry point, examine the window and the cut screen, and work through the practical checklist that begins every serious abduction case. Friends, relatives, neighbors, recent visitors, known offenders nearby, any unusual contact with the family, any prior incident that now looked different. That last category is often where cases begin to turn. At first, a lot of prior contact looks irrelevant. A laborer hired for yard work, a person seen near the property, a strange conversation remembered only because it now feels connected. The challenge in the first hours is that investigators do not yet know which detail belongs in the center and which belongs nowhere at all. They must collect without yet understanding. Meanwhile, outside the house, the case was already expanding beyond the family's control. Searchers assembled. News crews began to move in. The image of a 14-year-old taken from her bedroom was too alarming to stay private for long. Cases involving children can become media events quickly. Cases involving a child removed by force from her own home become something larger almost immediately. The story had the elements that trigger public fixation: innocence, intrusion, darkness, and the terrifying thought that ordinary household safety had failed. Head and Lois Smart were now forced into two roles at once. They were parents trying to understand whether their daughter was alive, and they were also becoming central figures in a public search. In the earliest hours, that meant answering questions while still barely understanding the sequence themselves. What was Elizabeth wearing? Did she have reason to leave voluntarily? Had she been upset? Did the family have any enemies? Did anyone suspicious know the house? Those questions are routine in a criminal investigation, but they carry an extra cruelty in the first morning of an abduction. Families are asked to become archivists of their own vulnerability. Every handyman, every recent visitor, every odd interaction suddenly has to be remembered and reweighed. Something that once looked trivial may now look dangerous. Something once dismissed as strange may now look like preparation. In the Smart case, hindsight would make one of those categories especially important. The family had previously encountered a man who called himself Emmanuel. He had done handyman work for them months before. At first, that fact did not immediately become the center of the case. In the first hours, it was one detail among many, but it sat there quietly, waiting for recognition. The early police response also had to confront another difficulty, common in abductions, and especially severe in this one. The offender had left very little immediate forensic clarity. There was evidence of forced entry, but not the kind of scene that instantly handed investigators a suspect. No one saw a license plate. No one reported a loud struggle spilling into the street. No obvious trail immediately gave the direction of travel. It was a violent act that had been executed with alarming control. That control made the case feel worse, not better. A chaotic offender can leave mistakes. A composed one can leave only absence. As the morning developed, officers and searchers focused heavily on the nearby foothills, not because they knew Elizabeth was there, but because the terrain was close, reachable on foot, and consistent with how a person could leave the house without being noticed. The search around the neighborhood and hillside reflected a simple but urgent calculation. If the abductor had not yet traveled far, Those early hours were the best chance to interrupt captivity before it deepened into disappearance. But early searches are haunted by what they cannot see. Thick brush hides movement. Dawn changes light but does not solve geography. Searchers may pass close to a person and never know it. Later, that same morning would look different under the weight of what was eventually learned. At the time, though, police were still operating inside a narrow, factual frame. Elizabeth had been taken. The intruder had entered deliberately. The nearby hills offered concealment. The clock was moving in the abductor's favor. There was also the issue of public messaging. Once a child abduction becomes known, law enforcement and family have to balance urgency against uncertainty. Move too slowly, and leads are lost. Move too broadly, and rumor begins to flood the case. In the first hours of the Elizabeth Smart investigation, police and the Smart family had little choice but to mobilize publicly. Elizabeth's name, face, and disappearance could not remain local. The logic was obvious. Someone might have seen something. Someone might recognize a man moving with a teenage girl in the dark or at dawn. But the opening of a case to the public also changes its atmosphere. It creates witnesses, and it creates noise. Every tip comes with hope. Most lead nowhere. Some damage the case by spreading speculation faster than facts. The Elizabeth Smart case would eventually attract a huge amount of both. Yet on that first day, the public phase was still in its rawest form. Flyers, interviews, television coverage, and search efforts had not yet become a months-long national machine. They were just beginning. Back inside the investigation, Mary Catherine's memory remained one of the most delicate and important pieces. Her account was not static. Like many witness memories, especially those formed under trauma, it sharpened over time. Investigators had to treat that carefully. They needed what she knew, but they also needed to avoid shaping it for her. The risk in cases involving children is not only that memory can fade, it is that outside pressure can distort it. The first hours are therefore full of caution as well as urgency. Even so, one idea was slowly starting to harden. The intruder's behavior did not look random. He seemed to know where to go. He seemed to know how to get in. He seemed to know that Elizabeth was there. Whether that meant prior surveillance, prior contact, or direct familiarity with the family was still unknown. But the possibility that the abductor had some knowledge of the house was no longer easy to ignore. That shift matters because it changes the emotional logic of the crime. A stranger who breaks into a home is terrifying. A man who breaks into a home after having studied it or after having already been welcomed near it is something else. It means the danger did not begin at the window. It began earlier while no one yet understood that a threat was forming. As June 5th went on, that was still only an emerging suspicion. The case remained defined by absence. Elizabeth was missing. The house held signs of intrusion, but no clean answer. The family had a partial witness, not an identification. The city had a growing search, not a lead strong enough to end it. And the investigators had a feeling that the offender did not simply stumble into this crime. It seemed small until it didn't. By the end of those first hours, one fact was becoming harder to shake. This abductor had moved through the Smart home with a degree of familiarity or preparation that did not fit an ordinary nighttime intruder. The window had been cut, the room had been found, the girl had been removed, and the house had been left behind in stunned silence. Police still had no named suspect, but the case was beginning to lean toward a darker conclusion. The man who took Elizabeth Smart may not have been a faceless outsider at all. He may have been someone who already knew enough about the family to come directly for her. Once the first morning passed, The Elizabeth Smart case stopped being only a police investigation and became a public event. Her photograph began appearing across Salt Lake City and far beyond it. Volunteers handed out flyers. Television stations repeated her name. Reporters gathered outside the smart home. The image that drove everything was simple and hard to forget. A 14-year-old girl had been taken from her own bedroom while her family slept nearby. That fact gave the case unusual force almost immediately. Missing person cases can begin in uncertainty. A teenager may have left voluntarily. A witness may be mistaken. A timeline may unravel into something less criminal than first feared. But the Elizabeth Smart case came into public view with a cut screen, an open window, and a child witness who said a man had stood over the bed and taken her sister away. Even before the investigation had a suspect, the public already understood the basic shape of the danger. Ed and Lois Smart quickly became central to that public effort. They were not simply grieving parents behind police tape. They were now speaking into cameras, appealing for information, trying to keep their daughter's name in circulation while the hours turned into days. That role brought visibility, but it also brought pressure. Every statement had to serve two purposes at once. It had to reach Elizabeth if she was somehow able to hear it, and it had to reach the public in case someone had seen the man responsible. The family's visibility helped make the case national news, so did the timing. In 2002, major television coverage still had enormous power to concentrate public attention on a single missing child. Elizabeth's age, the method of abduction, and the setting inside the home gave networks a story that viewers could not easily dismiss as distant. The crime touched a fear that felt broadly shared. It suggested that ordinary domestic safety could fail without warning. And once that kind of story enters the national bloodstream, it begins to change shape. The search for Elizabeth quickly produced more than organized effort. It produced a flood. Tips came in from across the country. Reported sightings placed her in places where she had never been. People who had seen suspicious men, suspicious cars, suspicious vans, suspicious campgrounds, suspicious preachers, or simply suspicious behavior began calling in. Some tips were sincere but impossible to verify. Some were based on resemblance. Some were based on coincidence. Some belonged more to the emotional logic of fear than to evidence. That is one of the paradoxes of high-profile cases. Public attention can save a life. It can also bury investigators under information that only looks useful from a distance. In the Elizabeth Smart case, both things happened at once. Law enforcement needed publicity. They needed Elizabeth's face visible. They needed people to remember what she looked like and to report anyone moving with a girl who matched her age and appearance. But that same visibility created a second problem. The case became a canvas for projection. Members of the public did not just report what they knew. They began attaching themselves to the story with theories, intuitions, and private certainties. Psychics entered the picture early, as they often do in nationally watched disappearances. Some claimed to sense where Elizabeth was. Some offered maps, impressions, or symbolic readings. Others contacted the family or the media with confident pronouncements that were unsupported by evidence. This was not unique to the Smart case. High-profile child disappearances attract people who believe they can see what investigators cannot. But the effect can be corrosive. Time is pulled away from verifiable leads. Family members are exposed to false hope. The public begins to confuse emotional conviction with factual value. The psychic attention also revealed something about the atmosphere surrounding the case. It was not simply that people cared, it was that they could not tolerate not knowing. The idea of Elizabeth being somewhere out there, alive or dead, hidden or moving, known or unrecognized, was intolerable enough that people rushed to fill the gap with narrative. In the absence of a suspect, certainty became a commodity, and many people offered it cheaply. Meanwhile, the official investigation kept grinding through reality. Searches continued around the foothills and beyond. Detectives worked through acquaintances, neighbors, known offenders, local reports, and prior contacts with the Smart family. The practical labor of a kidnapping case is methodical, even when the public side feels frantic. Investigators must separate what is merely dramatic from what can be proved. That process is slow, and in a case that had already become national news, slowness could look like failure. At first, many of the leads pointed nowhere. Reported sightings did not hold up. Suspect descriptions were too vague or too generalized. The most obvious possibilities were explored because they had to be, not because they were especially promising. That included local offenders, drifters, and people known to have committed crimes against children. In a broad search, such categories are inevitable, but a wide net is not the same as a useful one. The difficulty was built into the original crime. The abductor had entered quietly, left little behind, and disappeared before the family even knew Elizabeth was gone. That meant the public knew the offense was real, but not enough about the offender to recognize him easily. The story had immense emotional force and relatively little descriptive precision. That mismatch helped explain why the case expanded so fast without resolving. As days became weeks, the national coverage hardened around recurring images. Elizabeth's school portrait, the Smart family speaking to cameras, flyers posted in public places, searchers moving over rough terrain, police briefings that offered concern, but few decisive answers. For the audience at home, the repetition of these scenes created a familiar rhythm. For investigators and the family, repetition felt different. It meant Elizabeth was still missing. The case also generated public speculation that moved into more uncomfortable territory. Once a disappearance remains unresolved long enough, people begin to test explanations that are not grounded in evidence. In the Smart case, rumor touched many directions. Some speculated about strangers, others looked at fringe religious groups. Some even drifted toward unfounded suspicion around the family itself, as happens too often in major missing child cases when the public confuses visibility with guilt. None of that speculation was supported by the facts later established in court, but it circulated anyway. That is one of the darker side effects of national attention. It does not merely spread information. It produces alternative stories, many of which are built on nothing stronger than discomfort and repetition. For Ed and Lois Smart, that meant carrying not only grief and uncertainty, but the burden of staying legible in public. They had to keep Elizabeth in front of the country without losing control of the narrative entirely. Their public appeals were not dramatic in the theatrical sense. They were direct, focused, and insistent. They asked people to keep looking, to keep remembering, to keep reporting. In a case where time seemed to be draining meaning out of every day, that insistence mattered. But while the public looked outward, the investigation still had to look backward. The first backward look was toward the house itself, and anyone who had crossed through the family's orbit before June 5th. That is often where stranger abduction cases begin to complicate. A person first treated as incidental starts to look less incidental. A prior visit to the property stops feeling harmless. A face or voice from before the crime lingers in memory differently. These shifts rarely happen all at once. They gather. Mary Catherine Smart was central to that gathering. In the earliest phase, she had provided what she could, a frightened child's account of a man in the room and a sister being taken. But witness memory is not always fixed at the first telling. Sometimes it sharpens when fear has room to settle and the mind begins to sort through what it heard. In Mary Catherine's case, one aspect of the memory kept pressing forward. The voice. She had heard the intruder speak during the abduction. At first, she could not place him. That uncertainty was understandable. The room was dark. She was terrified. The event itself was almost impossible. But over time, the sense that the voice was familiar became harder to ignore. That familiarity did not immediately come with a name. It came as discomfort, as recognition without conclusion, as the feeling that the man who entered the house may not have been wholly unknown to the family after all. Later, that same moment would look very different. The family had once known a man who called himself Emmanuel. He had done handyman work for them after Lois Smart encountered him asking for help and hired him for labor around the property. At the time, he presented as a religious eccentric, not as the future center of a nationally watched abduction case. He had been on the property. He had spoken with family members. He had been seen enough to become part of memory without becoming important. That was the problem. At first, it looked like a minor detail. In hindsight, it became one of the most disturbing details in the case. Mary Catherine's growing recognition did not instantly solve the abduction, but it began to change the direction of attention. The intruder's voice and the remembered presence of Emmanuel started to align. This was not yet the kind of identification that could end a search overnight. Memory had to be handled carefully. Detectives could not simply force a conclusion because it felt promising. But the possibility that the offender had a known connection to the family had now moved from vague unease to something more actionable. That development mattered for several reasons. First, it changed the meaning of the crime. If the offender was someone who had previously worked for or around the Smarts, then the kidnapping had not begun at the kitchen window. It had begun earlier, during contact that had seemed harmless enough to permit him access. Second, it helped explain the offender's confidence. A man familiar with the property and the household would need less guesswork. He would know where to go and how to move. Third, it reframed the public image of the case. This was starting to look less like an anonymous nighttime predator and more like a man who had passed near the family before anyone understood what he was. And yet even then, the case did not resolve immediately. Recognition is not arrest. Suspicion is not recovery. Detectives still had to locate the man, confirm the lead, and determine whether the person Mary Catherine remembered as Emmanuel was in fact the same person who had taken Elizabeth. Meanwhile, Elizabeth remained missing. Public attention continued to expand. The gap between what people wanted and what law enforcement could actually prove remained painfully wide. The media environment intensified that gap. Once the case was established as national news, every development became its own mini-event. Searches, interviews, reports of sightings, televised appeals, and law enforcement statements all fed a cycle that made it seem as though movement was constant, even when the actual investigation was trapped in uncertainty. For viewers, the story was always active. For those inside it, there were long stretches in which hope and evidence refused to meet. That mismatch helped make the case feel uniquely haunting. Elizabeth Smart's face was everywhere. Her name was familiar across the country. People knew the basic facts. They felt they knew the family, and yet nothing decisive seemed to happen. She had become one of the most recognized missing children in America without becoming easier to find. Then came another shift. As detectives followed the growing lead around Emmanuel, public identification became part of the strategy. Composite images and later photographs connected to Brian David Mitchell were circulated. Media coverage of the suspect's image widened the search in a new direction. This was no longer just the search for Elizabeth. It was increasingly the search for a man whose connection to the family now looked deeply suspicious. Tips generated by his image began to matter in a different way, because the public finally had more than a missing girl to look for. That was the turning point in structure, even if not yet in outcome. The case had begun with a vanished child and a faceless intruder. It was now moving toward something more specific and more disturbing, the possibility that the kidnapper had stood near the family before, spoken in their presence, worked on their property, and then returned in the dark to take their daughter. The nation was still looking, but for the first time, the search was beginning to narrow around someone who had once had a place, however brief and strange, inside the edges of the Smart family's ordinary life. While the public search widened across Salt Lake City and then across the country, Elizabeth Smart was not in some distant unknown place. She was in the foothills above her own neighborhood, hidden in rough ground, close enough to home that the geography of the case would later seem almost impossible to accept. Searchers were looking outward. Television viewers were imagining highways, border crossings, and remote compounds. But in the earliest stage of her captivity, the reality was more disturbing than that. She had been taken uphill and kept nearby. That fact changes how the case feels once it is known. It means the first separation between Elizabeth and home was measured not only in terror, but in distance that remained shockingly small. The city below continued moving. Her family pleaded for help. Search teams combed the area, and above them, concealed by terrain and by the control imposed on her, she remained alive and trapped. Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee took Elizabeth into the foothills soon after the abduction. According to Elizabeth's later testimony and the evidence presented in court, they established her in a concealed campsite where the first phase of captivity began. The camp was not an improvised stopping point in the casual sense. It became the setting for a regime of domination that combined isolation, threats, pseudo-religious ritual, physical restraint, and repeated sexual abuse. The reality of what happened there is essential to the case, but it does not require sensational language. The facts are severe enough on their own. Mitchell did not present himself to Elizabeth merely as a man hiding a kidnapped child. He wrapped the captivity in his own religious language and authority claims. Prosecutors later described his self-styled prophetic identity as part of the method by which he justified control and sexual violence. Elizabeth's testimony made clear that he used those beliefs, or claimed beliefs, not as abstract eccentricity, but as a coercive framework. He cast himself as spiritually empowered. He treated obedience as law. He turned captivity into a system. One of the earliest acts in that system was a forced marriage ceremony. That ceremony did not soften the crime. It clarified it. It showed that Mitchell was not treating the abduction as temporary possession or ransom leverage. He was constructing a world in which he could present himself as entitled to Elizabeth's body and future. In court, the prosecution used such details to show planning, predation, and the way his religious claims functioned as tools of domination rather than mere delusions operating in isolation. Elizabeth later testified that she was chained by the ankle in the camp. Restraint mattered not only physically, but psychologically. It told her that escape was not a simple matter of standing up and running. It also reinforced the idea that Mitchell and Barzee controlled every condition of her survival. In a wilderness setting with limited food, no safe route, and constant threats, even small acts of restraint become much larger than the hardware itself. They redefine the victim's understanding of what is possible, and then there was the violence. Food and deprivation also became instruments. Elizabeth described being starved and controlled through access to basic necessities. In public imagination, kidnapping is often pictured as chains, locked rooms, and visible force. In many real cases, captivity is also built from hunger, exhaustion, disorientation, and dependency. A victim does not need walls if every condition around her has been rearranged to make escape feel equivalent to death. In the Foothills camp, that principle was already in place. Forced alcohol and drug use deepened the control. According to Elizabeth's later testimony, Mitchell and Barzee gave her substances as part of the captivity. Again, this mattered for more than immediate impairment. It weakened clarity, altered time, and helped create an environment in which obedience and survival became entangled. The public would later ask why she did not flee sooner or identify herself more forcefully when chances seemed to appear. The answer begins here. Coercive control was not an abstract label attached after the fact. It was built piece by piece in the Foothills. Barzee's role is especially important in this chapter of the story because cases like this are often flattened around a dominant male offender. That flattening would be false here. Wanda Barzee helped sustain the captivity. She participated in the abduction and in the enforcement of the world Mitchell created. Later court proceedings and her own guilty plea established her as an accomplice, not a passive observer. In the Foothills, she functioned as both enabler and active participant in the structure keeping Elizabeth trapped. That is one reason the camp was so effective as a site of control. Elizabeth was not dealing with a single captor whose attention might lapse. She was inside a closed system of two adults who reinforced each other's authority. Mitchell could threaten, preach, and assault. Barzee could monitor, assist, and legitimize the rules of captivity by behaving as though they were normal within that isolated world. It was a small social unit, but for Elizabeth, it became the entire environment. Outside that environment, public life continued to intensify. Searchers looked over hillsides and into neighborhoods. News reports circulated Elizabeth's face. Volunteers passed out flyers. Law enforcement followed leads that mostly dissolved. What no one in those public scenes could see was that the case had already entered a second stage, one far more difficult than the abduction itself. Once a victim is isolated long enough inside an offender's logic, recovery becomes not only a matter of finding a place, it becomes a matter of breaking a system. Mitchell's use of veils and robes would become more publicly visible later, especially when he moved Elizabeth through public spaces. But the control behind those disguises was already being developed in the camp. Clothing, concealment, renaming, and ritual all worked together. They stripped away normal identity and replaced it with the identity Mitchell assigned. This was not symbolic in a harmless sense, it was operational. If Elizabeth could be made to inhabit the role he created for her, then the outside world might become harder for her to reach, even when it was physically near. That is one of the central contradictions of the case. The public often imagines captivity as distance. Elizabeth's captivity was also proximity. She was near the city, near search efforts, and near the life that had been taken from her. But proximity did not mean access. She was concealed by terrain and controlled by fear. Even when noise from the outside world existed below, it did not translate into rescue. In hindsight, that proximity became one of the most disturbing details in the case. The Foothills camp also forces a rethink of what early search operations can and cannot do. Searchers may be geographically close and still fail completely if the victim is hidden well, moved carefully, or too frightened and controlled to reveal herself. Public discussion sometimes treats missed proximity as proof of incompetence. Real investigations are more difficult than that. Brush, elevation, timing, concealment, and the victim's condition all matter. In Elizabeth's case, the terrible truth was that she could be close enough to home to sharpen the tragedy without being realistically visible to the people trying to find her. There were moments in captivity when Elizabeth understood the stakes with brutal clarity. Mitchell threatened her life and the lives of her family members. Such threats are critical to understanding the behavior that followed across the 9 months. He did not need to persuade her that escape was risky. He needed only to persuade her that any attempt to resist would bring catastrophic consequences. Under those conditions, even a child's natural impulse to run becomes trapped inside calculations about who will be hurt afterward. The forced marriage language intensified that logic. It reframed ongoing abuse as obligation and recast refusal as disobedience, not only to Mitchell, but to the religious structure he claimed to represent. Courts and trauma experts later helped the public understand that victims under coercive control often do not behave in ways outsiders expect. But those later explanations were rooted in lived facts. In the foothills, Elizabeth was being trained under threat to survive within a reality imposed by people who controlled food, movement, punishment, and meaning itself. Even the passage of time inside the camp would have worked against resistance. Days in hiding do not move like ordinary days. Without routine, privacy, or safe contact, time becomes another weapon. The outside world keeps counting. Inside captivity, the victim counts only what the captors allow. That dislocation matters because it weakens the ordinary anchors people rely on to make decisions. The question stops being, "When can I get away?" and starts becoming, "How do I get through the next threat?" Meanwhile, the public case kept evolving in ways that seemed dramatic, but were often disconnected from the immediate truth. The national search produced theories and sightings. It produced television urgency and emotional appeals. It produced the impression of movement. Yet for Elizabeth, the early phase of the ordeal was defined less by movement than by containment. The first prison was not a basement or a locked room. It was a hidden camp above the city, held together by chains, terror, sexual violence, and the fanatic logic of her captor. That mismatch between public imagination and private reality is one reason the case retained such power. People imagined a missing girl in motion. For crucial stretches, she was being held in place. Another unsettling element is how ordinary Mitchell and Barzee's concealment strategy could look from a distance. A hidden campsite in nearby foothills does not sound like the architecture of a nationally infamous kidnapping. It sounds temporary, unstable, even reckless. But that is exactly what makes it frightening. They did not need a fortress. They needed enough isolation, enough psychological control, and enough delay in recognition to keep the crime going. In those first days and weeks, that was enough. Barzee's presence reinforced the false reality Elizabeth was being forced to inhabit. A female accomplice can create a warped sense of legitimacy, especially for a child. It suggests a household rather than a solitary predator. It suggests rules rather than chaos. In this case, Barzee helped present Mitchell's authority as something lived and accepted, not merely ranted. Later, her guilty plea would formally establish her criminal responsibility. But the underlying fact was visible long before the plea. The captivity worked in part because two adults maintained it together. As the days turned into weeks, the camp in the foothills became the first proof that the central mystery of the case was not just where Elizabeth had gone. It was how captivity could be built so close to home and still remain invisible. The crime had started with a break-in, but it was sustained by a structure that blended physical concealment with coercive control. Mitchell and Barzee did not simply hide Elizabeth, they worked to alter her reality, and all the while, the search continued below. That is the image that remains hardest to absorb, not only because of the violence, though the violence was severe, not only because of the age of the victim, though she was 14, but because she was being held near the city that was looking for her, near the family that was pleading for her return, and near the home from which she had been taken. The foothills were not another world. They were part of the same landscape. That was what made the truth so unsettling. Elizabeth Smart was not lost in some unknowable distance. For a crucial part of her captivity, she was hidden almost in sight of the life that had been broken open on June 5th. And when that became known later, it changed the meaning of the entire search. The country had imagined a child taken far away. In fact, during those first terrible weeks, she was being held shockingly close to home. By the time investigators moved closer to Brian David Mitchell, the image of the case had already started to change. The abduction no longer looked only like the work of an unknown intruder slipping through a cut window in the dark. It was beginning to look like something more intimate and more deliberate. The man at the center of it had not appeared from nowhere. He had crossed the edges of the Smart family's life before. He had stood on their property. He had spoken in their presence, and then, months later, he came back in the night and took their daughter. That shift matters because it changes the emotional architecture of the crime. A stranger breaking into a home is terrifying. A man who has already been let near the home is different. It means the threat began earlier, while it was still disguised as something manageable. It also helps explain the confidence of the abduction itself. Brian David Mitchell did not seem to move like a man guessing. He moved like a man who already knew enough. Mitchell was, by the time of the kidnapping, a deeply unstable and self-styled religious figure who had drifted through homelessness, street preaching, and his own private prophetic identity. He was known to use the name Emmanuel. He presented himself in robes, spoke in religious language, and described grand spiritual claims that prosecutors later argued were woven directly into his predatory conduct. His public eccentricity was real, but the case against him was never that he was merely bizarre. It was that he used that world of prophecy and revelation as part of a system that enabled abduction, rape, and control. That distinction became crucial in court, but it mattered just as much in understanding how he functioned before the kidnapping. Religious delusion alone does not explain a targeted break-in. It does not cut a window screen, enter a family home, locate a teenage girl, and remove her without waking the house. Whatever else Mitchell believed or claimed to believe, the crime itself showed planning, focus, and a clear objective. His connection to the Smart family began months before the abduction. Lois Smart encountered Mitchell in Salt Lake City and offered him work as a handyman. He performed labor at the family home, including outdoor tasks. At the time, he appeared as an unusual, religiously intense man, but not yet as the future center of a national kidnapping case. Like many dangerous people before they are recognized as dangerous, he entered memory first as a troubling but containable presence. Later, that same presence would look very different. In hindsight, the handyman connection became one of the most disturbing details in the case. It offered a plausible explanation for how Mitchell knew the property, why he seemed able to move with confidence, and how he may have selected Elizabeth as a target. It also sharpened the central violation. The person who abducted her was not simply a random predator who chose a house in the dark. He was a man who had already been invited onto the grounds. That was not proof at first of the entire plan, but it made people uneasy. Mary Catherine Smart's recognition helped bring that unease into clearer focus. In the early aftermath of the kidnapping, she could not immediately identify the intruder, but over time, the voice she had heard in the bedroom began to align with someone the family already knew. The man called Emmanuel. That memory did not solve the case by itself, but it moved the investigation closer to a specific and deeply troubling conclusion. The offender might not be anonymous at all. He might be someone whose earlier presence had seemed only strange, not lethal. Mitchell's self-presentation made him easy to misread. He could appear disorganized, grandiose, erratic, and detached from ordinary life. Those qualities can make a person seem less dangerous to outsiders, especially when they are encountered in public settings where they register as eccentric rather than criminal. But predators are not always hidden beneath polished surfaces. Sometimes instability and threat exist together. Sometimes religious language, theatrical identity, and visible oddness do not reduce danger. They conceal how determined it is. Prosecutors later argued that Mitchell's religious ideology was not background color. It was part of the machinery of the crime. He cast himself as a prophet. He used revelation language to justify sexual access to girls and women. He developed a structure in which his desires could be reframed as divine instruction. That did not mean every claim he made was strategic in the coldest sense, but it did mean that his worldview and his predation were intertwined in ways that mattered legally and factually. Elizabeth's kidnapping fit within that structure. The forced marriage ceremony, the renaming, the control of clothing, the insistence on obedience, and the framing of sexual abuse as sanctioned all reflected a system larger than a single moment of violence. Mitchell was not improvising a story after the abduction. He was imposing a story he had already built for himself, one that turned coercion into sacred order. And then there was Wanda Barzee. Too often in cases involving a dominant male offender and a female accomplice, the woman is reduced to a shadow role. That reading fails badly here. Barzee was not just present, she was involved. Her later guilty plea formally established criminal responsibility for kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor. But even before the legal resolution, the evidence showed that she helped sustain the captivity and the worldview in which it operated. Barzee had married Mitchell years earlier, after both had prior marriages and significant personal instability behind them. By the time of Elizabeth's abduction, she had become not merely Mitchell's companion, but an active participant in the system he was enforcing. In captivity, Barzee helped impose rules, supported Mitchell's claims of authority, and participated in maintaining control over Elizabeth. She was not an accidental witness trapped by circumstances. She became part of the structure that kept a 14-year-old girl captive for 9 months. That makes the title of this chapter more than a phrase. The prophet and his wife were not colorful secondary figures orbiting the case. They were the case. Mitchell provided the dominant ideology, the sexual violence, the abduction plan, and the public face of religious authority. Barzee helped translate that authority into daily captivity. Together, they created a closed world in which Elizabeth's identity, movement, and survival were controlled. At first glance, Barzee's role can seem less visible because Mitchell so often occupied the center of public attention. He was the one in robes, the one preaching, the one whose image became so recognizable later. But the problem was not only that he acted, it was that he did not act alone. A child held by one offender may watch for breaks in supervision, signs of doubt, or moments of weakness. A child held by 2 adults who reinforce one another faces something more durable. The control becomes social as well as physical. That social durability is one reason the captivity lasted so long. Mitchell and Barzee did not simply guard Elizabeth. They worked to redefine reality around her. They demanded compliance. They used threats. They imposed clothing and ritual. They isolated her from ordinary identity. And because 2 adults shared that world, it could be presented not as one man's madness, but as a functioning order to which Elizabeth was expected to submit. The prosecution would later point to testimony and evidence suggesting Mitchell also spoke about plans involving multiple wives and additional girls. Those claims are important, but they need careful framing. They were presented through testimony and prosecution theory, not as a completed program with every part independently proven in action. Still, they mattered because they helped show that Elizabeth's kidnapping was not random in the emotional sense. Prosecutors argued that Mitchell's ambitions and beliefs were already oriented toward taking girls and building a religiously justified sexual hierarchy around himself. If that is true, then the smart kidnapping becomes even more disturbing. It was not only an opportunistic crime against one girl, it was part of a larger predatory imagination that had already made room for more. One revealing feature of Mitchell's earlier contact with the Smart family is how little it would have taken at the time to dismiss him as merely bizarre. Families often encounter unstable or highly religious strangers in cities without imagining future violence. A man looking odd, speaking strangely, or living outside conventional norms does not automatically signal kidnapper. That is precisely why hindsight in this case is so sharp. The warning signs exist only after the fact as a coherent pattern. Before the kidnapping, they were fragments. The same is true of Mitchell's presence around the house. Handyman access can seem routine. A person working on outdoor repairs or yard labor becomes part of the visual background for a short time. He is noticed, but not studied. Yet that kind of brief, legitimate access can be incredibly valuable to a predator. It offers information without suspicion. It reveals layout, routines, entry points, visibility, and the rhythms of family life. Later, what looked like harmless presence can become evidence of preparation. That is one reason the case still unsettles people so deeply. It forces a confrontation with how danger can arrive through ordinary hospitality. The Smart family did what many decent people do. They helped someone and hired him for work. Nothing about that act made them responsible for what followed, but it did reveal how a predatory mind can exploit access that was granted in good faith. Meanwhile, as Mitchell and Barzee held Elizabeth, the public search kept moving through a very different narrative. America saw flyers, interviews, and appeals. The nation discussed a missing child. Investigators followed leads. But the internal reality of the case had already shifted into something harsher. This was no longer just a search for an abducted girl. It was the unraveling of a system built by two adults who had constructed religious meaning around sexual violence and submission. That system is also why later public questions about Elizabeth's behavior needed reframing. Why did she not flee sooner? Why did she sometimes comply? Why did she initially give a false name when approached at rescue? Those questions only make sense if one first understands Mitchell and Barzee together. Mitchell terrorized and violated her. Barzee backed him, normalized the rules, and helped maintain a world in which disobedience seemed likely to lead to death or harm to her family. Compliance under those conditions was not consent. It was survival. Mitchell's public persona further complicated recognition. His robes, beard, and street preacher appearance were memorable, but they also made him seem like someone who belonged to the margins rather than the center of a planned kidnapping. In some ways, his strangeness shielded him. People noticed him as odd. They did not necessarily process him as capable of a crime this organized, but organized he was. The evidence later showed movement across state lines, sustained captivity, and repeated efforts to keep Elizabeth hidden in plain sight. Barzee's presence again mattered there. She helped make the group appear at moments less like an abductor with a hostage and more like an unconventional family unit. That false appearance was one of the most effective features of the concealment. A robed man, a woman, and a veiled girl could pass through public spaces as unsettling, but not immediately criminal. In a country where people often hesitate to intervene in strange domestic or religious-looking situations, that ambiguity bought them time. At the time, no one knew how much time. The closer investigators moved toward Mitchell, the more the original abduction began to look less like a single eruption of violence and more like the visible opening of a longer plan. The break-in, the selection of Elizabeth, the use of religious language, the forced marriage, the captivity in the foothills, and Barzee's participation all pointed in the same direction. This was not a faceless intruder acting on impulse. It was a predatory pair operating within a private belief system that helped them justify and sustain the crime. That realization changed the center of the case. The offender was no longer just the man who took Elizabeth. He was Brian David Mitchell, a self-proclaimed prophet who had once stood near the family in daylight. And the woman beside him was no bystander. Wanda Barzee was an accomplice whose role made the captivity more stable, more convincing from the inside, and harder to break. The nation still did not know where Elizabeth was, but investigators were getting closer to something crucial. The man who had entered the smart home in the dark may never have been a stranger in the true sense. He had already crossed into the family's world once before. The offender was starting to acquire a face, a history, and a wife who had helped make the nightmare last. One of the most disturbing facts in the Elizabeth Smart case is not only that she was abducted and held for 9 months, it is that during part of that captivity, she was moved through public spaces while her face was already known across the country. Her photograph had been broadcast on television, her disappearance had become national news, flyers had circulated widely. The search had become one of the most recognized missing child cases in America. And yet, Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee were still able to walk with her in view of other people. That contradiction is central to understanding the case. Public visibility did not equal public recognition. The country was looking for Elizabeth Smart, but the real Elizabeth had been altered, concealed, threatened, and taught to move inside a false identity. She was not being presented to the world as a missing girl. She was being presented, as much as Mitchell and Barzee could manage, as part of their own strange religious household. Mitchell and Barzee moved Elizabeth between Utah and California during the captivity. That movement later became an important part of the federal case because it established interstate transportation of a minor for sexual purposes. But beyond the legal meaning, the travel reveals something else. This was not a static imprisonment in one hidden place. It was a mobile captivity, and mobility created both risk and concealment. Each move exposed them to possible recognition. Each move also allowed them to blend into the ordinary anonymity of roads, campgrounds, sidewalks, and public life. The disguise mattered. Elizabeth was made to wear long robes and a veil. Her appearance was controlled in a way that did more than hide her face. It changed the entire frame through which strangers saw her. A teenage girl walking openly beside a man later identified from national coverage would have drawn more scrutiny. A veiled girl walking with a robed preacher and a woman could be interpreted in several ways, many of them less urgent. The disguise did not make her invisible. It made her legibility uncertain, and uncertainty is often enough. That is one reason the case stayed with the public so deeply. People tend to imagine recognition as simple. They assume that if a missing child's photograph has been widely shown, then seeing that child in real life should trigger immediate alarm. But real recognition is much messier. People notice context before identity. They process clothing, posture, group dynamics, age, distance, and expectation. If a person does not appear to fit the exact frame of danger, the mind often explains them away before suspicion fully forms. Elizabeth's captors used that weakness well. Mitchell's appearance was itself a kind of shield. He did not look like a conventional suburban kidnapper. He looked like a fringe religious figure, a street preacher, an unstable drifter, a man from the social margins. His robes and beard made him memorable, but not necessarily in a way that translated into immediate criminal recognition. People could see him, register him as strange, and still fail to connect him to the most searched-for child abduction in the country. That gap between noticing and understanding repeatedly worked in his favor. Barzee helped complete the disguise of normality, or at least the disguise of a functioning group. A lone man with a frightened teenage girl is one kind of scene. A man, a woman, and a veiled girl together can read differently, especially in public settings where bystanders hesitate to intervene in something that might be familial, religious, or simply unfamiliar. Barzee's presence did not reduce the danger. It reduced the likelihood that outsiders would instantly name what they were seeing. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was not moving through these spaces as a free witness, waiting for the perfect moment to speak. By this stage, she had already been subjected to months of rape, starvation, threats, indoctrination, disguise, renaming, and coercive control. Mitchell had threatened not only her life but the lives of her family members. He had worked to convince her that disobedience would bring catastrophic consequences. When the public later asked why she did not run from the first crowded place or shout her name to the first passerby, those questions overlooked the system that had already been built around her. Hidden in plain sight is not only about clothing, it is about conditioning. Mitchell and Barzee brought Elizabeth into towns, stores, and other public areas during the captivity. Later witness recollections would add a chilling layer to the story. Some people remembered encounters that had seemed odd at the time. A veiled girl, a robed man, a group that felt unusual enough to notice but not unusual enough to stop. In hindsight, those moments took on a different weight. They were not strange scenes on the edge of ordinary life. They were missed opportunities for recognition. That does not mean those witnesses failed in some simple moral way. Recognition is not retrospective certainty. Most people are not expecting to stumble into the center of a nationally famous kidnapping case while moving through ordinary errands. Most people do not assume that an uncomfortable or eccentric scene in public is evidence of a child being held under threat. The horror lies less in personal failure than in how easily coercive captivity can coexist with public life when the signs are ambiguous enough. Elizabeth's own behavior in those moments must also be understood through the logic of trauma. Outsiders often imagine that a rescued victim will look eager to be noticed, but victims under sustained control may do the opposite. They may speak minimally. They may avoid eye contact. They may follow instructions rigidly. They may protect the captor's story because they have learned that reality is punished and compliance is survival. None of that is irrational inside captivity, even if it looks confusing from the outside. In the Elizabeth Smart case, this issue became especially visible because the opportunities for recognition were so public. She was not hidden the entire time in a sealed room. She was occasionally passing near other people while the country searched for her. That made the case feel almost unbearable once the facts were known. It seemed impossible that she could be that near, that exposed, that publicly present, and still remain captive. But the impossibility is exactly what happened. Mitchell's strategy depended not on perfect concealment, but on layered confusion. The veil obscured identity. The religious presentation disrupted normal assumptions. Barzee's presence softened the appearance of overt threat. Elizabeth's trauma-conditioned compliance reduced the chance of spontaneous disclosure. And the public, even when uneasy, lacked the confidence to transform unease into action. None of these factors alone would guarantee invisibility. Together, they were enough to keep the crime moving. There is also a practical fact that often gets lost in retellings. People do not walk around with the details of every active case sharply in mind at all times, even very famous ones. A news image seen at home is not the same as a live encounter in an unexpected place, with altered clothing, different posture, changed hair, or partial concealment. Memory is comparative. It needs a trigger. In the Elizabeth Smart case, that trigger repeatedly failed until it finally did not. Some of the most chilling material in this chapter is not dramatic in the usual sense. It is mundane, passing through town, being seen by strangers, existing in daylight. Those ordinary moments are what make the captivity feel so close to public knowledge and yet so unreachable. This was not only a hidden camp story or a remote wilderness story, it was also a public space story. Elizabeth was being held inside a world that brushed against ordinary society without being fully recognized by it. And then there were the close calls. As the search intensified and Mitchell's identity became more publicly circulated, the chances of recognition increased. People who had seen his image in news reports or police materials were better positioned to connect the robed man in public with the case. That did not produce immediate rescue, but it changed the atmosphere around every sighting. The group was no longer just unusual, it was becoming identifiable. Even so, discovery did not happen all at once. This is important because major cases are often remembered as though the truth became obvious the moment the right photograph aired or the right lead emerged. In reality, recognition builds unevenly. People half remember. They doubt themselves. They discuss a sighting after the fact. They hesitate over whether what they saw was truly connected. In the gap between suspicion and action, offenders continue moving. At the time, no one knew how many such gaps there had already been. For Elizabeth, those public movements must have carried their own terrible duality. The outside world was visible again. Other people were nearby. Stores, sidewalks, cars, daylight, and voices all existed within reach. But none of that dissolved the control Mitchell and Barzee had built. Public proximity can intensify captivity rather than relieve it when the victim understands that one wrong word may trigger punishment or violence. Freedom is more tormenting when it looks near and remains inaccessible. The legal significance of the travel later gave prosecutors a firm structure. Movement between Utah and California was not incidental. It supported federal charges and helped show the continuity of the crime. But the narrative significance is even larger. It shows that Mitchell and Barzee did not simply hide Elizabeth once and keep her still. They managed her as moving property inside their own system. They shifted location, adapted visibility, and trusted that disguise and fear would keep working. For a long time, they were right. The public, meanwhile, kept trying to solve the case through the tools available to it. Viewers watched news updates. Families discussed sightings. Volunteers circulated materials. Police fielded tips. The country looked, but it looked through the imperfect filters of clothing, distance, expectation, and ordinary hesitation. That is why the phrase "hidden in plain sight" fits so precisely here. Elizabeth was not unseen in the literal sense. She was seen without being understood. In hindsight, those same moments become unbearable to review. Each ordinary public appearance invites the same question. How close did rescue come? How many times did someone notice something and then let it pass? How many times did the truth move by under a veil, beside a robed man in the company of a woman who made the scene appear less immediately criminal than it was? These questions do not produce easy blame. They produce a deeper discomfort with how perception actually works. The case also forces a correction to the popular fantasy that victims will always seize the first chance to escape. By the time Elizabeth was being moved through public spaces, she had been conditioned by months of terror. Mitchell had reshaped the meaning of action itself. Speaking could mean death. Running could mean retaliation against her family. Giving the wrong answer could bring punishment. Under such pressure, silence is not passivity. It is a learned survival response. As the months went on, the possibility of recognition kept drawing closer. Mitchell's image had been publicized. His link to the Smart family had changed how investigators and media framed the case. The more his face entered circulation, the more dangerous public space became for him. Yet even then, the crime did not break immediately. He and Barzee still managed to move with Elizabeth in settings where bystanders saw something strange without quite seeing the truth. That is what makes the eventual break so powerful. It was not the first moment in which discovery could have happened. It was the moment in which ambiguity finally collapsed. Someone looked, remembered, trusted the connection, and acted. But before that happened, there was a long and haunting period in which Elizabeth Smart remained visible enough to be near rescue and hidden enough to stay captive. The country was searching for her face while she walked through parts of the world with that face covered, her name suppressed and her will bent around fear. Discovery kept seeming close, and then, again and again, it slipped away. By March 12, 2003, Elizabeth Smart had been missing for 9 months. In public, the case had settled into that unsettling category of stories that remain constantly present without moving toward resolution. Her name was still widely known. Her abduction still carried national weight. But time had begun doing what time often does in major cases. It had layered the original shock with fatigue, rumor, and the slow fear that a girl can disappear so publicly that people begin to live around the absence. Then in Sandy, Utah, that pattern broke. The rescue did not begin with a dramatic raid or a forensic breakthrough. It began with ordinary recognition. 2 couples saw a robed man, a woman, and a veiled teenage girl walking together. Something about the scene caught their attention. It was not only that the group looked unusual. By then, Brian David Mitchell's image had been circulated publicly enough that the sight of him could trigger memory. The men and women who noticed the group did not have final proof in front of them. They had something more fragile and more important in that moment. They thought they might be looking at the people from the Elizabeth Smart case. That is how many real turning points happen. Not with certainty, but with suspicion strong enough to survive self-doubt. The location mattered too. This was not an isolated trail, a canyon, or a remote campsite. It was public space in the same broad world that had been searching for Elizabeth for months. The contradiction that had defined the case was still in place. She was again close to other people, close to visibility, close to the possibility that a stranger might connect the scene in front of them to the girl whose photograph had been on television. This time, the connection held. The witnesses contacted police. That decision was the actual break in the case. Recognition alone is not enough. Someone has to trust it, act on it, and accept the possibility of being wrong. In high-profile cases, bystanders can hesitate for all kinds of reasons. They may assume someone else will call. They may worry about embarrassing themselves. They may decide the resemblance is too uncertain to matter. On March 12th, the people who saw Mitchell and the veiled girl did not let uncertainty cancel action. Police responded and stopped the group. What happened next is one of the most revealing moments in the entire case because it showed how deeply Mitchell's control still held, even at the edge of rescue. Officers questioned the veiled girl. She did not immediately identify herself as Elizabeth Smart. Instead, under the influence of months of terror, indoctrination, threats, and forced identity, she gave a false name. That detail confused some members of the public later. To others, it seemed to complicate the image of an obvious rescue, but in fact, it was entirely consistent with the reality of coercive control that had been built around her. Elizabeth had lived for months under threat. Mitchell had trained her to believe that disobedience could bring deadly consequences for her and for her family. By the time police stood in front of her, she was not responding from a place of restored freedom. She was responding from inside captivity, even as that captivity was beginning to crack. This is one of the central lessons of the case. Rescue is not always psychologically immediate. A victim does not always become outwardly rescued the moment officers arrive. The body may be in public. The threat may still feel absolute. Mitchell, meanwhile, continued trying to control the situation. His confidence had carried him through months of movement in public and near-public settings. He had managed to pass through spaces where other people noticed him, but failed to act decisively. This stop was different, but the habits of control remained. He had spent months defining reality for Elizabeth. It would have been entirely in character for him to believe he could continue doing so under questioning, at least long enough to avoid collapse. Barzee was there as well, still part of the same unit that had sustained the captivity. Her presence at the stop matters for the same reason it mattered throughout the 9 months. She helped create the appearance of a group, a household, a strange but functioning social arrangement rather than an unmistakable abduction scene. Yet by March 12th, that arrangement was no longer holding together under the pressure of recognition. At the time, police still had to proceed carefully. Even if the officers strongly suspected they had found Elizabeth Smart, they needed to verify who the girl actually was. They were confronting a teenage victim who was veiled, frightened, and not immediately giving them the answer the country wanted. Cases can turn disastrously when authorities assume too quickly or mishandle the first moments of contact. The officers on scene had to move from suspicion to confirmation without losing control of the situation. That process is what makes the rescue moment so powerful. It was not cinematic in the artificial sense. It was procedural, tense, and fragile. The truth was close enough to touch and still not fully secured. Eventually, officers identified the girl as Elizabeth Smart. The 9-month disappearance ended there, not in a blaze of public spectacle, but in the collapse of a false identity that had been forced on a child for most of a year. Once that identification was made, the structure Mitchell and Barzee had built around her could no longer function. The robed prophet, the wife, the veiled girl, the invented names, the religious narrative, the threats, the movement through public space without recognition, all of it finally gave way to a documented fact. Elizabeth Smart had been found alive. That fact is so important that it can obscure how narrow the margin still was. The rescue did not happen because the system of control had naturally weakened to the point of safety. It happened because ordinary people recognized something called police, and the officers persisted through the initial confusion of the stop. Without those steps, the group might have kept moving. The case might have continued. Discovery was close, but it still required action at every stage. Once Elizabeth was identified, Mitchell and Barzee were taken into custody. For the public, this was the moment when a case long suspended in fear and speculation suddenly snapped into concrete reality. The missing girl was alive. The suspected abductor had a name and a face. The strange couple moving with her were no longer figures at the edge of rumor or grainy public memory. They were the people who had taken and held Elizabeth Smart. But rescue did not instantly answer everything. It ended the disappearance. It did not immediately convert 9 months of captivity into a clean narrative. Elizabeth still had to be separated from the influence of her captors. Investigators still had to understand what had happened, where she had been, how she had been moved, and what crimes could be proven in court. The stop in Sandy was the break in the search. It was not the end of the case. That distinction matters because public resolution and investigative resolution are not the same thing. Viewers often remember rescue as the end of uncertainty. In reality, it is often the beginning of a different kind of work. In Elizabeth's case, that work would involve trauma, statement-taking, corroboration, and the reconstruction of a captivity that had stretched across places, months, and multiple forms of abuse and coercion. But on March 12th, before any of that could happen, there was first the simple and extraordinary fact of recovery. Alive. That word changed everything. For 9 months, the country had searched in the dark space between hope and dread. Child abduction cases do not usually permit easy optimism. The longer time passes, the more the imagination begins to narrow toward death. Elizabeth's rescue interrupted that logic. She was not only alive but found in public, within the same region from which she had vanished, after months in which the central contradiction of the case had kept repeating itself. She had been hidden near other people, while almost no one understood what they were seeing. The stop in Sandy also revealed, in compressed form, the entire architecture of the case. There was Mitchell, still dressed in the image he had built around himself. There was Barzee, still functioning as companion and accomplice. And there was Elizabeth, still carrying the visible effects of the identity and control imposed on her. The rescue scene was not separate from the captivity. It was the captivity made visible one final time before it broke. Public reaction was immediate and enormous. After months of posters, interviews, search efforts, and speculation, the news that Elizabeth Smart had been found alive transformed the story overnight. Relief surged across the media coverage. But relief was accompanied by a second reaction too, disbelief at the mechanics of what had happened. She had been out there all along. She had been moved in public. She had at times been near enough to other people to be recognized, and it had still taken 9 months for the right combination of memory, courage, and police intervention to bring the case to its turning point. That disbelief was justified. It reached into the deepest contradiction the case exposed. Visibility is not the same as safety. Public space is not the same as freedom. A victim can be seen and still remain captive if coercion, disguise, and social hesitation are strong enough. For Elizabeth herself, the rescue moment carried a more complex reality than the public celebration suggested. The outside world saw recovery. She had to cross back from a world in which survival depended on obedience, false identity, and fear. That crossing is not instant. It does not happen the moment police say a name out loud. It begins there, but it unfolds over time. This is why the false name she initially gave matters so much. It was evidence not of confusion in the case, but of the depth of control she had endured. Mitchell's arrest turned the man once known to the Smart family as Emmanuel into something more fixed in the public record, the abductor at the center of the case. The long chain of suspicion, recognition, public circulation of his image, witness memory, and missed public visibility had finally resolved into custody. The same was true of Barzee. Her role could no longer hide behind Mitchell's larger presence. She had been there at the rescue, just as she had been there during the captivity. What happened in Sandy on March 12, 2003, was not simply the recovery of a missing child. It was the moment a 9-month illusion collapsed. For months, Mitchell and Barzee had sustained a private reality in which Elizabeth's name, body, and future were under their control. They had walked her through public spaces, kept her under threat, and relied on the world's uncertainty to protect them. In Sandy, that uncertainty finally failed. The officers stopped the group. The questions began. The false name came first, then the truth. And with that, the disappearance that had gripped the country was over. Elizabeth Smart was identified, separated from her captors, and returned to the world that had been searching for her since the night she was taken from her bedroom. What remained now was a different task entirely: to turn rescue into evidence, survival into testimony, and 9 months of captivity into a case that could hold in court. The rescue of Elizabeth Smart ended the search. It did not end the work. Once she was recovered on March 12, 2003, the case entered a new phase that was quieter in public, but just as important in consequence. Investigators now had the central fact they had lacked for 9 months. Elizabeth was alive and could describe what had happened, but a criminal case is not built from one fact alone. It has to be assembled from statements, corroboration, timelines, documents, physical evidence, and legal theory strong enough to survive trial. That transition is where many famous cases become less visible to the public. The drama of the disappearance gives way to procedure. The emotional clarity of rescue gives way to the slower demands of proof. In the Elizabeth Smart case, that process was especially delicate because the victim had endured prolonged captivity, repeated sexual abuse, interstate movement, and intense coercive control. Investigators were not simply taking a statement about one night. They were reconstructing 9 months of crime. Elizabeth's own account became central immediately, but it could not be treated casually. She was a teenage victim emerging from months of threats, indoctrination, and trauma. Any interview process had to account for that reality while still preserving evidentiary value. Investigators needed her memories, but they also needed to avoid distorting them through pressure or haste. This is one of the less visible disciplines of serious case building. A survivor's first detailed account may contain the core of the truth, but truth in court still has to be anchored to independently verifiable facts wherever possible. In Elizabeth's case, that meant separating different layers of the story. Some facts were straightforward and largely undisputed. She had been abducted from her home on June 5, 2002. She had been found alive on March 12, 2003, with Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee. Mitchell had a prior connection to the Smart family through handyman work. The group had moved through different locations during the captivity. Those facts formed the skeleton of the prosecution. Other elements depended more heavily on testimony, attribution, and interpretation. The forced marriage ceremony, the religious justifications Mitchell used, the precise structure of control inside the camps and while traveling, and the language of his broader intentions all required careful framing. Much of it came from Elizabeth's account, later supported in part by Barzee's admissions and testimony, as well as by the logic of the offender's own behavior. But prosecutors still had to distinguish what could be directly corroborated from what was principally established through witness testimony. That distinction is not weakness. It is how honest prosecutions are built. The movement across state lines quickly became a major legal focus. Elizabeth had not only been kidnapped, she had been transported between Utah and California. That movement was critical because it brought the case firmly into federal jurisdiction. A crime that had begun with a break-in in Salt Lake City could now be framed not only as a local or state offense, but as an interstate kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor. Those charges would later define the structure of the federal case. This is where law does something important in major crimes. It converts the moral horror of events into precise categories a court can adjudicate. The public knew Elizabeth had suffered. Prosecutors had to show exactly which statutes were violated, by whom, through what acts, and over what span of time. Moral certainty is not enough in a federal courtroom. The case had to be translated into chargeable conduct. Mitchell's role in that translation was direct. He was the primary abductor. He had entered the smart home, taken Elizabeth, subjected her to sexual abuse, and moved her across state lines. The evidence pointing to him did not depend on one single witness or one dramatic piece of forensic proof. It rested on the convergence of multiple facts: his connection to the family, Mary Catherine Smart's eventual recognition of him as the intruder, Elizabeth's own detailed account, his recovery in public with Elizabeth on March 12th, and the broader pattern of conduct investigators were able to document afterward. Barzee's role required equal seriousness, even if it was sometimes treated as secondary in public memory. She had not simply stood near Mitchell after the fact. She had participated in the kidnapping and captivity. Her conduct mattered both factually and legally. Prosecutors had to show that she was not a passive spouse trapped in Mitchell's world, but an accomplice who knowingly helped sustain the crime. Over time, that picture became increasingly clear. Her later guilty plea would formalize it, but the case-building phase already pointed strongly in that direction. Her federal prosecution also requires chronology, and chronology in this case was complicated. Investigators had to map the abduction, the foothills campsite, the subsequent movements, the public appearances, and the final recovery. They needed to establish where Elizabeth had been when, how the movement occurred, and what acts corresponded to which legal violations. Captivity often feels continuous to the victim. In court, continuity must still be broken into provable segments. That mapping process also helped the government distinguish between what was emotionally powerful and what was legally essential. The image of Elizabeth veiled in public was unforgettable, but the prosecution had to do more than say she had been hidden in plain sight. It had to show transportation, coercion, sexual exploitation, and the participation of both offenders in a way a jury could later evaluate. Some facts were memorable because they shocked the public. Others were memorable because they carried legal weight. The strongest cases align both. Investigators also had to think ahead to challenges the defense might raise. Mitchell's religious language, bizarre behavior, and self-styled prophetic identity were not only features of the crime, they were obvious candidates for a future mental state defense. That did not mean the government could ignore them. It meant prosecutors needed to document carefully where his conduct showed planning, awareness, and intentionality. A man can be grandiose, delusional, or unstable, and still commit a legally purposeful kidnapping. The evidence had to preserve that distinction. That is why the practical details mattered so much. Entry through the cut window screen, movement to a concealed camp, the use of disguises, travel between states, management of public exposure, threats used to maintain silence. All of these suggested operational control rather than random, incoherent drift. They did not erase questions about Mitchell's mental condition, but they did help show that the crimes themselves were structured and sustained. Elizabeth's statements were therefore crucial, not only as victim testimony, but as narrative architecture for the prosecution. Through her account, investigators could explain how the abduction became captivity, how captivity became a mobile system, and how the offenders maintained control. Her testimony later gave the public one of the clearest windows into the reality of those months. But before it reached a courtroom, it had to function as investigative material. It had to guide corroboration, identify locations, clarify timelines, and anchor the state's understanding of what exactly would be charged. This is one reason rescue is only the beginning in crimes of prolonged captivity. Once the victim is safe, the burden shifts toward memory. But memory alone is not enough. Investigators must ask, what else supports it? Are there witness sightings? Are there known travel routes? Are there records placing the offenders in specific areas? Are there admissions, statements, or behaviors from the offenders that align with the account? Every answer tightens the case. Barzee became especially important in that tightening. Her eventual cooperation and plea would come later, but even before that, her presence in the crime gave investigators leverage and structure. Two offenders create more opportunities for contradiction, corroboration, and differential legal pressure than one. Prosecutors could examine Barzee's participation not only to prove her own guilt, but also to illuminate Mitchell's conduct. In multi-offender cases, one defendant often becomes the bridge that stabilizes the government's overall narrative. Barzee would eventually serve that role. The public image of the case after rescue was still dominated by relief. Elizabeth was alive. That fact understandably overshadowed the technical labor happening behind the scenes, but investigators had to resist the temptation to assume the public story would automatically become the courtroom story. High-profile cases can be surprisingly vulnerable when early assumptions go untested. A narrative that feels emotionally complete on television may still collapse under legal scrutiny if the evidence is not carefully organized. In the Elizabeth Smart case, one of the prosecution's strengths was that the major themes of the public story did correspond to facts that could be charged and proven. There really had been an abduction from the home. There really had been sustained captivity. There really had been interstate travel. There really had been two offenders functioning together. The challenge was not inventing a theory that fit public emotion. The challenge was presenting a structure of proof precise enough to survive defense attack. That structure took formal shape in March 2008, when a federal grand jury indicted Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee. The charges included interstate kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor across state lines for sexual purposes. By then, the case had moved well beyond the immediate shock of rescue. It had been converted into a federal prosecution with named defendants, defined counts, and a legal pathway toward trial and plea. The timing of that indictment also shows how serious cases can move on a different clock than the public expects. To outside observers, 5 years might seem like delay. Inside major federal prosecutions, especially those involving trauma, competency questions, multi-state conduct, and the need for careful corroboration, time reflects the burden of getting the case right. An indictment is not just an accusation, it is a commitment to prove. By the time the federal case was formally in place, the core lines were clear. Mitchell was the principal offender who had abducted Elizabeth Smart, repeatedly abused her, and transported her across state lines. Barzee had helped carry out and sustain the kidnapping and captivity. Elizabeth's survival and statements had made prosecution possible, but the government had done the additional work required to frame those statements inside a broader evidentiary structure. Even then, not every issue was settled. Some details still depended heavily on testimony. Some elements of Mitchell's internal worldview would always be contested as to whether they were sincere delusion, manipulative ideology, or both. The exact boundaries between mental illness and criminal strategy would later become central in court. But those were future disputes. By the indictment stage, prosecutors had already done the essential work of turning a rescued child's account into a case recognizable to federal law. That transformation matters because it shows what justice depends on before any verdict is reached. It depends on patience. It depends on disciplined distinction between what is known, what is strongly supported, and what still requires attribution. It depends on resisting both sensationalism and simplification. In a case as publicly famous as Elizabeth Smart's, that discipline was especially important. the government could not rely on public outrage to do the work of proof. So the case that had once been defined by an open window and a missing girl now had a different shape. It had defendants, it had charges, it had a federal theory grounded in kidnapping, interstate transportation, and sexual exploitation. It had a victim who was alive and able in time to testify, and it had enough structure to move from rescue into litigation. The search was over. The story of survival was known in outline. What remained was the hardest part of many major crimes, to take months of captivity, fear, and fragmented memory, and fix them into a legal record that could hold. By the time the federal indictment arrived, that record had begun to take its formal shape. The case was no longer just the recovery of Elizabeth Smart. It was now the United States against Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee. By the time the Elizabeth Smart case reached federal court, the public already believed it understood the broad outline. A 14-year-old girl had been abducted from her bedroom. Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee had held her for 9 months. She had been recovered alive in Sandy, Utah. Those facts were no longer seriously in doubt, but a courtroom does not exist to confirm the public's emotional summary of a case. It exists to test evidence, define legal meaning, and decide which version of events can survive formal scrutiny. That is why the court phase mattered so much. It was the place where the story would stop belonging mainly to headlines, documentaries, and public memory, and begin to belong to the record. The path to trial was not quick. One of the biggest reasons was Brian David Mitchell's competency to stand trial. Competency is not the same as guilt or innocence, and it is not the same as an insanity defense. A defendant can be plainly accused of terrible crimes and still be legally unable, at least for a time, to participate meaningfully in trial proceedings. In Mitchell's case, that issue consumed years and delayed the full adjudication of the charges. For the public, such delays can feel infuriating. In a case with a living victim, a known defendant, and facts that seem already obvious, years of competency litigation can look like obstruction or theater. But competency questions are not side issues. They go to the legitimacy of the trial itself. A conviction reached while a defendant is legally incompetent would be vulnerable and potentially invalid. So the system had to determine whether Mitchell understood the proceedings and could assist in his own defense. That process became one of the strangest and most closely watched parts of the case. Mitchell behaved erratically in court and in related proceedings. He sang hymns. He disrupted hearings. He performed his religious persona in a way that made him appear deeply disconnected from the ordinary logic of trial. To many observers, his conduct looked like the outward proof of madness. To others, it raised the possibility that he was manipulating the process, using bizarre courtroom behavior to delay judgment or reinforce a future insanity narrative. The tension between those readings sat near the center of the legal fight. At the time, no one could resolve that tension through instinct alone. Courts do not decide competency by disgust, intuition, or television impressions. They rely on evaluations, hearings, expert opinions, and repeated judicial review. In Mitchell's case, that meant long delays while the legal system attempted to distinguish mental illness from strategic obstruction and spectacle from legally relevant incapacity. That distinction is one of the hardest in criminal law. A defendant can be mentally ill and still competent. A defendant can behave bizarrely and still understand the charges. A defendant can hold grandiose or delusional beliefs and still be capable of assisting counsel. The law does not ask whether a person seems normal. It asks whether the specific threshold for trial can be met. Eventually, after years of dispute and treatment efforts, the case moved forward. That transition mattered not only procedurally, but symbolically. It meant the court had concluded that whatever Mitchell's mental condition, the federal prosecution could proceed to trial. The crimes would now be tested in the setting where competing explanations had to confront evidence. Mitchell's defense was closely connected to mental state arguments. Public shorthand often reduces this to insanity, but the legal landscape was more precise than that. The central question was not whether Mitchell was a disturbing or irrational man. That much was already evident. The question was whether his beliefs and conduct deprived him of legal responsibility in the way required by federal standards. That is a narrow and demanding claim, not a general statement that someone is mentally unwell. The prosecution's response was built on structure. Mitchell had cut a window screen, entered a family home, selected a particular victim, moved her to concealed locations, disguised her, transported her across state lines, and maintained control over her for months through threats and coercion. Those acts were not random fragments. They formed a sequence of purposeful conduct. A defendant may be delusional, but if his actions show planning, concealment, and sustained operational control, the government can argue powerfully that legal responsibility remains intact. This is where the Elizabeth Smart case became especially important beyond its immediate facts. It forced the court to examine the intersection of religious delusion, predatory behavior, and criminal purpose. Mitchell's self-presentation as a prophet was real in the sense that he used it constantly. But the law had to ask whether that prophetic identity erased responsibility or instead functioned as part of the mechanism by which he justified and carried out the crimes. The prosecution argued the latter. Mitchell's beliefs, however strange, did not negate the deliberate nature of the kidnapping and sexual exploitation. They were part of the system he used to control Elizabeth. In this framing, prophecy was not an excuse. It was a tool. Wanda Barzee's role changed the courtroom dynamics in a different way. In November 2009, she pleaded guilty to kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor. Her plea was not merely an administrative development, it was a major shift in the evidentiary landscape. By pleading guilty, she acknowledged criminal responsibility and removed herself from the category of co-defendant, still fully contesting the case. She also became available, under the terms of her plea, to testify against Mitchell. That mattered enormously. A female accomplice who had helped sustain the captivity could now help describe it from inside. Barzee's testimony was not automatically pure or unquestionable. Plea agreements always raise issues of incentive. A witness who testifies in exchange for negotiated treatment by the government must be assessed carefully. The defense can argue motive to please prosecutors. The jury must weigh credibility. But the existence of such incentives does not erase testimony. It simply places it in a framework the court can examine openly. Barzee's plea also carried its own public meaning. For years, Mitchell had dominated the image of the case. He was the robed prophet, the singular face of the horror. Barzee's guilty plea fixed her role more sharply in the public record. She was no passive spouse carried along by a stronger personality. She was legally acknowledging that she had participated in the abduction and transportation of Elizabeth Smart. That formal acknowledgement mattered because it aligned the legal record with what the facts had long suggested. Then there was Elizabeth herself. When Elizabeth Smart testified at Mitchell's federal trial in late 2010, the case moved into its most serious moral register. This was no longer simply a prosecution theory reconstructed from reports, timelines, and legal filings. The victim was now in court, under oath, describing the reality of her captivity. That testimony was central not because it added theatrical weight, but because it brought the most direct evidence of the crime into the courtroom. Her testimony described the abduction, The concealment in the foothills, the forced marriage, the repeated sexual abuse, the threats, the movement between states, and the coercive control exercised by Mitchell and Barzee. The public had known many of these facts in outline. In court, they were fixed with greater precision and legal consequence. Her account also helped explain conduct that outsiders had often misunderstood, including her compliance during captivity and her initial use of a false name when police stopped the group in Sandy. That explanation mattered. The courtroom was one of the few places where trauma responses could be translated into evidence rather than misread as inconsistency or consent. Elizabeth's testimony showed how fear, conditioning, threats, and prolonged domination shaped survival behavior. In doing so, it corrected one of the most persistent public confusions around the case. The issue was never why she went along. The issue was how thoroughly Mitchell and Barzee had built a world in which resistance seemed likely to end in death or retaliation. Courtrooms are imperfect places for that kind of truth. They demand structure from trauma. They impose sequence on experiences that may have felt like one continuous nightmare. They require witnesses to answer questions with precision, even when memory formed under terror. Yet those limits are exactly why Elizabeth's testimony mattered so much. It was not vague, not speculative, and not dependent on media retelling. It was direct evidence from the person who had lived through the crime. Meanwhile, Mitchell's courtroom behavior continued to complicate the atmosphere. He did not present as an ordinary defendant. His religious singing and disruptions reinforced the image of a man operating inside his own belief system. To some observers, this behavior strengthened the insanity narrative. To others, it looked like one more attempt to dominate the room, derail process, or transform the proceeding into an extension of his prophetic self-dramatization. The jury had to see past the performance and evaluate the actual legal questions. That is one of the quiet disciplines of trial. A defendant may be bizarre, repellent, theatrical, or pitiable. None of that decides the verdict. The question is whether the charged crimes were proven and whether any recognized defense has been established under law. In Mitchell's case, the prosecution's advantage was that the broad factual record held together. The abduction from the home was supported by the original evidence and witness accounts. Mitchell's connection to the Smart family was established. Elizabeth's recovery with Mitchell and Barzee was undisputed. The interstate transportation was part of the documented case. Barzee's guilty plea reinforced the structure. Elizabeth's testimony supplied the human and factual core. The defense could contest legal meaning, mental state, and responsibility. It could not plausibly erase the underlying sequence. That is why the trial was less about who did it than about how the law would interpret what kind of actor Mitchell was. Was he so mentally ill that criminal responsibility failed under federal standards? Or was he a mentally disturbed but legally accountable predator whose bizarre beliefs coexisted with deliberate criminal conduct? The verdict would answer that question in the only place where it truly counted. On December 10, 2010, the jury convicted Brian David Mitchell of kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor for sexual activity. The verdict did more than punish a defendant. It fixed the case in the public record as one in which the prosecution's story had survived the legal tests placed against it. Mitchell's prophetic identity, courtroom disruptions, and mental state arguments had not displaced the evidence of purposeful kidnapping and prolonged sexual exploitation. The sentencing followed on May 25, 2011. Mitchell was sentenced to life in federal prison, plus additional years with no possibility of parole. Sentencing is often described as closure, but that word can be too neat for a case like this. No sentence restores lost time. No judgment removes what happened in the foothills, in the camps, on the roads, or in the public moments when Elizabeth remained captive beside other people. What sentencing does is something narrower and still essential. It marks the formal conclusion of legal responsibility. For Barzee, the legal path was different because of her plea. She too would be sentenced, and her role would remain part of the official record through both her admissions and her testimony. The divergence between her route and Mitchell's route reflected one of the practical realities of criminal justice. Co-defendants do not always arrive at judgment the same way. One may plead, one may go to trial, one may help prove the other's guilt. The system is not symmetrical, it is strategic. In the end, the courtroom phase of the Elizabeth Smart case did what courts are meant to do at their best. It stripped away the distortions of rumor, spectacle, and performance, and forced the central claims into legal form. Mitchell's competing story, built around mental illness and prophetic identity, was heard and tested. The prosecution story, built around planning, captivity, sexual violence, and coercive control, was also tested. The jury chose between them. And the choice mattered, because this case had always generated competing stories. During the search, the public produced theories. During the captivity, Mitchell imposed a false religious narrative on Elizabeth's life. In court, those habits of competing explanation narrowed into one final legal question. Would the documented facts be interpreted as the acts of a legally responsible kidnapper or as conduct excused by mental incapacity? The verdict answered clearly. Brian David Mitchell was guilty. The sentence made that answer durable, and with that, the case that began with a cut window screen and a child taken from bed was no longer just a national nightmare or a recovery story. It was now fixed in the law as a convicted kidnapping and sexual exploitation case, with the facts formally tested, the defendants separated by plea and verdict, and the public record no longer dependent on speculation. The Elizabeth Smart case did not end when Brian David Mitchell was sentenced to life in federal prison. Legally, the major questions had been answered. The abductor had been identified, tried, convicted, and sentenced. Wanda Barzee had pleaded guilty. The record was fixed. But some cases do not remain important because the verdict is still missing. They remain important because the facts continue to press against the way people think crime, captivity, and survival are supposed to work. This is one of those cases. At the center of it is a contradiction that still unsettles people years later. A teenage girl was taken from her bedroom at knifepoint, hidden in the foothills near her own home, moved through public spaces, transported between states, and seen by other people while the country searched for her face. She was not invisible. She was visible without being recognized, visible without being understood, visible while remaining under control. That contradiction is the reason the case still echoes. It exposed a gap between what people assume they would notice and what they actually notice. For many members of the public, the most haunting question was never only how Brian David Mitchell committed the kidnapping. It was how he and Wanda Barzee managed to keep Elizabeth in plain sight for so long. That question leads quickly into a second one. Why did she not escape the first time she was near other people? The answer is not mystery. It is coercive control. One of the most important legacies of the case is that it forced a wider public conversation about how trauma actually works. Before Elizabeth Smart spoke more openly about her experience, many people still carried simplistic ideas about victims. They imagined that a kidnapped girl would run at the first opportunity, shout her name to the first passerby, or resist in ways that outsiders could easily recognize as resistance. Those ideas are emotionally satisfying because they preserve the illusion that survival remains straightforward under terror, but they are often false. Elizabeth's case showed why. She was abducted at 14. She was threatened, abused repeatedly, starved, isolated, renamed, veiled, and taught that disobedience could lead to her death or the deaths of people she loved. Mitchell did not merely restrain her body. He worked to restructure her understanding of consequence. Barzee helped reinforce that system. By the time Elizabeth was passing near other people, captivity was no longer just a physical condition. It had become a psychological environment. That distinction matters because it changes the meaning of behavior that once confused the public. Compliance was not consent. Silence was not safety. Giving a false name when first questioned by police was not evidence of uncertainty about what had happened. It was evidence of how deeply coercion had penetrated her survival instincts. The case became one of the clearest public examples of the fact that victims do not always look like people waiting to be rescued in obvious ways. Sometimes they look composed, sometimes they look obedient, sometimes they protect the very story that is harming them because the cost of doing otherwise still feels unbearable. Elizabeth Smart later became one of the most visible advocates for that understanding. In the years after the case, she spoke publicly about trauma, shame, sexual violence, and the ways victims are judged by people who have never lived inside sustained coercion. Her advocacy mattered not because it added emotion to an already emotional case, but because it gave public language to realities that had often been distorted or left unsaid. She did not only survive the crime, she helped explain it in a way that changed how others understood victim behavior. That is part of why the story continues to matter beyond its own facts. The kidnapping of Elizabeth Smart became not only a criminal case, but a reference point in broader discussions about abduction, sexual violence, and trauma response. It showed that captivity can be maintained through belief, threat, ritual, and dependency as effectively as through locked doors. It showed that visibility can fail as protection. And it showed that recovery does not always look like the dramatic opposite of captivity. Sometimes the victim is still carrying the logic of captivity at the very moment she is found. The case also continues to echo because of what it revealed about perception. The public tends to trust recognition more than it should. People assume that if a missing child has been heavily publicized, then ordinary citizens will identify that child on sight. But the Elizabeth Smart case demonstrated how fragile recognition really is. Clothing changes the frame. Context changes the frame. Group dynamics change the frame. A veiled girl walking with a robed man and a woman does not arrive in the mind as national missing child case unless something clicks past uncertainty. And uncertainty is powerful. Most people are not prepared to intervene in situations they cannot immediately define. They hesitate. They reinterpret. They assume they may be misunderstanding what they are seeing. In this case, that hesitation became part of the machinery that allowed the crime to continue. Not because bystanders were cruel or indifferent, but because human perception is not built for constant decisive action under ambiguity. That is one of the most uncomfortable truths the case leaves behind. Public life contains far more tolerated strangeness than people like to admit, and predators can use that. There is also a deeper social lesson in the way Mitchell and Barzee appeared together. A lone man with a frightened child is one kind of alarm. A man, a woman, and a veiled girl can be processed very differently. The presence of a woman softens suspicion for many observers. It suggests domesticity, family structure, or at least something less immediately predatory. Barzee's role was therefore significant not only in the direct criminal sense, but in the social camouflage of the crime. She helped make the group easier to overlook. That detail still matters because it complicates one of the easiest narratives in criminal cases. The idea that evil is always simple to spot. It is not. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in religion. Sometimes it moves with ordinary rhythm. Sometimes it includes a woman whose presence lowers public alarm. Sometimes it looks wrong without looking clearly criminal. And in that gap, danger continues. The case also remains powerful because of how close to home it began and, for part of the time, remained. Elizabeth was not taken from a distant place and lost immediately into a different world. She was abducted from her bed and first held in the foothills above the same city that was searching for her. That geographic proximity still shocks people because it seems to violate the assumed logic of search and rescue. If she was that close, how was she not found sooner? The answer is not simple incompetence. Search operations work within terrain, time, concealment, and the victim's ability to signal. In Elizabeth's case, those conditions all favored the captors. She was hidden in rough ground. She was under threat. She had already entered a survival mode shaped by terror. Searchers may be near and still never see what matters. The tragedy of proximity is not that it makes rescue inevitable, it makes failure harder to bear. The legal resolution also left its own lasting meaning. Mitchell's conviction and life sentence established that whatever his mental illness or prophetic self-image, the law treated him as a responsible actor who had deliberately abducted and abusing a child. That mattered because the case had always risked distortion through his bizarre persona. It would have been easy for the public to reduce him to madness and stop there. The court record resisted that simplification. Mitchell was not only disturbed, he was convicted. He had planned, acted, concealed, transported, and controlled. The legal outcome preserved that distinction. Barzee's plea and later role in the case preserved another important distinction. She was not a background figure lost in Mitchell's shadow. She was a participant. That matters because people often search for a single monstrous center and let accomplices fade into the edges. But crimes like this frequently depend on more than one person. Barzee's involvement helped make the captivity more stable, more persuasive from the inside, and less legible to the outside world. Her role remains part of the case's enduring warning about how shared delusion or shared predation can harden into a functioning system. For Elizabeth Smart herself, the echo of those 9 months did not remain limited to private recovery. She became a public figure not by choice at first, but by necessity after the crime. Over time, she used that position to advocate for victims, speak about safety and trauma, and challenge the shallow narratives often imposed on survivors. That advocacy did not erase what happened, but it changed the afterlife of the case. The story did not remain frozen only as a nightmare from 2002 and 2003. It became part of an ongoing conversation about what survivors need from the public, the media, and the justice system. And that may be one of the most significant reasons the case still holds attention. It is not only the story of a kidnapping, it is also the story of what people learned too late while watching it unfold. They learned that a child can be missing and still near home. They learned that a victim can be seen and not recognized. They learned that coercive control can keep someone silent in full view of others. They learned that religious language can be used not as harmless eccentricity, but as an instrument of domination. And they learned that survival does not always present itself in a form the public finds easy to understand. The central contradiction remains as unsettling now as it was when the case first ended. Elizabeth Smart was alive for those 9 months. She moved through parts of the world where rescue seemed, in hindsight, almost within reach. Yet she remained captive, because captivity was operating on multiple levels at once: physical concealment, threats, sexual violence, isolation, psychological control, public ambiguity. Each alone would have been serious. Together, they made the crime durable. That durability is what still gives the case its weight. It forces a confrontation with how thin some ordinary protections really are. A home can be entered. Familiarity can be exploited. Publicity can fail to produce recognition. A victim can survive in ways outsiders misread. A crime can continue not because no one is looking, but because looking is not the same as seeing. There is no mystery left about who took Elizabeth Smart. The court record answered that. There is no mystery left about whether the kidnapping happened. The evidence answered that too. What remains unresolved in a broader sense is not the identity of the offenders, but the discomfort they exposed. The case showed how belief can be weaponized, how visibility can fail, how fear can reshape behavior, and how a child can be hidden inside plain sight while the country watches for someone else. That is why these 9 months still echo. They echo in conversations about missing persons and victim behavior. They echo in training about trauma and coercive control. They echo in the way parents think about safety, in the way investigators explain survival responses, and in the way the public now understands that rescue is not always a matter of willpower or opportunity. They echo because the facts resisted simple explanation, and because the person at the center of the case lived long enough to tell the truth about what those facts actually meant. In the end, the kidnapping of Elizabeth Smart remains one of the clearest examples of how captivity can exist at the intersection of force, belief, and ordinary public blindness. A girl was taken from her bedroom by a man the family had once known at the edges of daily life. She was held close to home, moved through public spaces, and kept under a system of terror disguised as prophecy. She survived. She was found. The law fixed the guilt. But the deeper lesson has never quite stopped unfolding, because this case was never only about a missing girl. It was about how easily a person can be present and still hidden, how thoroughly fear can reorder survival, and how the world can look directly at the truth and fail for far too long to understand what it is seeing. Thank you for spending this time with SnoozeCrime. The kidnapping of Elizabeth Smart remains one of the most disturbing cases of child abduction in recent American history. Not only because she was taken from her own bedroom, but because of what the case revealed afterward. A girl hidden close to home, a captor who had once passed briefly through the family's life, a victim seen in public and still not fully recognized, and 9 months of survival shaped by fear, coercion, and control. What remains is not uncertainty about who committed the crime. The federal case answered that. What remains is the deeper unease, the knowledge that captivity does not always look like what people expect, that trauma can silence a victim even in reach of other people, and that visibility is not the same as safety. Elizabeth Smart survived, and in the years that followed, she gave language to parts of this story that many people had long misunderstood. That may be one of the lasting reasons this case still stays with people, not only because of the kidnapping itself, but because it forced the public to confront how easily the truth can remain hidden inside plain sight. This is SnoozeCrime, real cases told slowly. Sleep, reflect, return.